I've always wanted to do something important with my time, and while sobriety was fun while it lasted, I think I want to put my skills into a more professional area. That's right, I'm gonna be a doctor, and you might be a bit worried, maybe because of my lack of experience in the medical field, but don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Out of all the video game genres that exist today, I find puzzle games to be easily the most replayable. There's just something about them that's so pure in its perception of fun, because just looking at it, I don't think a good case would be available. If you try to explain why they're fun to anyone around you who is unfamiliar with Picross, let's face it, you're never winning them over. But there are specific subsets of puzzle games that appeal to different types of people. You have the flat-out adventure games that incorporate large puzzle elements into the gameplay, and the only way to progress is by thinking critically. These are probably the most well-liked because of how many things can be done with the concept, but there are also logic-based puzzle games. Just keep in mind, if you see squares and X's on the screen, get out while you still can. This is the purest form of puzzle game entertainment out there. You can tell by the way I'm on the floor not breathing. You can either take the time to understand these and enjoy yourself, or find something that doesn't require both free time and effort. But that's where the falling block genre comes in. Get Out. This is easily the most overdone puzzle trope, and that isn't to say that these aren't good, it's just that most of them look the same. But I swear on my life that Tetris and Tetris Attack are not the same thing. Many of them are just different enough from each other to provide a completely different experience. And one famous franchise that falls under this branch is Dr. Mario. How does he do it? Dr. Mario is one of the most forgotten facets of Mario's lineage. Now you could argue that everyone's heard of Dr. Mario and could easily recognize its virus-busting gameplay, and while it is true to some extent, not many people are familiar with these games as much as something like Paper Mario or Mario Party. There's much less fanfare surrounding the releases of Dr. Mario games, probably because it's Dr. Mario. Does this really look like the face that's gonna solve all of your medical problems? I mean, come on, those pills look like they're gonna give me Lyme disease. It can be argued that all of the releases are far too similar to each other to be considered anything special. It isn't to say there isn't a dedicated fan base for any of these games, but when looking through its catalog, a few of the games are just hard to find any information on, either due to obscurity or a lack of effort. It's also possibly the strangest Mario series out there, acting as a guinea pig for many of Nintendo's efforts. It's insane to me just how many hoops this franchise was put through, despite much of it not mattering to any rational mind out there. The last physical release of any form of Dr. Mario was in 2005. Ever since then, he's been subject to every form of embarrassment Nintendo could muster. But before all of that, before Mario even obtained his PhD, he was an icon. From the early days of the NES and all the way up to the late 1980s, Mario was at the top of his game. Super Mario Bros. 3 was being hailed as one of the greatest games of all time, which is an opinion you might still hear being spread around retirement homes. But at the time, Mario was staying as consistent as possible. There were very few genres available under his name that weren't platformers, and when he did make an appearance in different types of games, he usually wasn't the main face of it. Except for Mario the Juggler, Mario's Cement Factory, and Mario's Bombs Away. They're his bombs. But nobody really knows or cares about those. Believe me, I checked their retirement homes. Mario was consistently pushed out as only a platformer, but one game would change his image entirely and shift the franchise towards rampant experimentation. And I'll be darned, Dr. Mario having that much of an influence over the future is more so scary than anything. On July 27th, 1990, Dr. Mario released on the NES and Game Boy to a great critical reception for most who played it. Both versions were very similar to each other, with no notable differences being present between the two, except for the fact that the Game Boy version is clearly the graphically inferior of the two. And if you're surprised by that, you've probably never even encountered one of these things before. Also, because the Game Boy can only really display two colors, one of the viruses is given a checkerboard pattern, which is just kind of funny to me. As for the NES version, I'm glad I can open my eyes now. Speaking from the perspective of a person who's played Dr. Mario, it's a really fun and addictive puzzle game that has remained timeless because of how well done everything in the game is. The music, the graphics, the smooth gameplay. It all feels like the NES running at its full capacity to deliver a perfectly acceptable experience. I'm actually more likely to play this than many of the other titles on the NES due to how quick and painless of an experience it is. Just playing for a few minutes is all you need to feel how raw entertainment was back when this game released. But one of the main complaints people had with this game at the time of its release was how it was far too similar to Tetris. I know this seems rather silly because of how many falling block puzzle games are out there nowadays, but back in 1990, this looked like plagiarism incarnate. But I honestly honestly can't agree with that being much of a bad thing. Just because it's another falling block game doesn't mean it doesn't give the genre its own personal twist and character. Dr. Mario and Tetris are two different beasts. And while Dr. Mario might be somewhat inspired by Tetris, Dr. Mario is enjoyable in its own way. But what's really important is that the success of this game gave rise to an era of expansion for what could have been considered a Mario game. Mario Paint, NES Open, and Super Mario Kart all followed in Dr. Mario's footsteps of bringing the Mario franchise several steps towards the powerhouse that it is today. So thank you, Dr. Mario. Because of you, I fear for my life. Versus Dr. Mario. I've been waiting a long time for this. The Versus System arcade cabinets gave rise to Nintendo after the video game crash of 1983. At a time when video games were starting to back themselves up from the gutter, the popularity of the Versus System arcade cabinets in North America helped Nintendo gain the confidence to release the Nintendo Entertainment System in the West. Most of the games used in the Versus System arcade cabinets were direct copies from their Famicom counterparts, and while they sold fairly in Japan, being able to release new arcade cabinets up until Versus The Quest of Keys released in 1988, Nintendo began to shift their focus more towards the Famicom in late 1985 due to a decline in the popularity of the Versus System. But in North America, the Versus System arcade cabinets maintained a huge success, leading to the creation of the NES as a way to bank off of the success of the Famicom games that were present on all of the Versus System arcade cabinets. Unlike the death of the Versus System in Japan, the Versus System strategy carried itself all the way to 1990 in North America, where its last release ended up being Versus Dr. Mario. If it wasn't apparent, this version of the game is heavily based on the NES release, which went for most other Versus System releases as well, on top of being heavily geared towards their multiplayer aspects. But at least Dr. Mario is the one that saw to the end of this era, because he's probably the most qualified for giving out death certificates. But possibly one of the most obscure pieces of Nintendo technology was a variant of the Game & Watch named the Game Watch Boy. Many people know about the Game & Watch series of Nintendo handhelds. However, there were many different types of them that were released. Case in point, the Game Watch Boy. Is that a word or a hidden message? The Game Watch Boy is a wristwatch manufactured by Mani Industries, mimicking the design of an old school Game Boy. And there doesn't exist much information on how these things came to being aside from that. The two games that were released for it were Super Mario Race and Dr. Mario. Releasing in 1993, this version of Dr. Mario gives two difficulty options, but I wouldn't know that because of how distracted I am by what is definitely the lowest quality way of playing Dr. Mario. I'm sure they tried their best considering the fact that this whole thing had to fit on someone's wrist, but I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. It is cute, I'll give it that, but the only other thing it's getting is the cold shoulder and an audit. On December 30th in 1994, Tetris and Dr. Mario released for the SNES, becoming one of the last SNES games to be released in North America. Hopefully this doesn't become a habit. It was also developed by Intelligent Systems, which makes too much sense when I really start to think about it. This game included an updated version of the NES Dr. Mario, doing it wonderfully with all these fancy new graphics. It even gives the ability to play against CPU players instead of waiting for another lonely soul to consent to playing Dr. Mario. Boy am I relieved. The other game included in the package is Tetris, and this honestly just goes to show how different these two games are, but they still manage to perfectly complement each other in a way that not many other 2-in-1 video games are able to accomplish. Just think about the schmuck who played Sonic Advance with Sonic Pinball Party. There's even a mode called Mixed Match, which is a multiplayer mode where each player has to swap between the two games and rack up the most points before time runs out. I was just about to throw these waivers away. Despite having the very simple basis of Tetris and Dr. Mario being under one roof, they went above and beyond with this one, making sure that it would be the best possible product. Dr. Mario BS version. It's that bad. The Satellaview is an add-on to the Super Famicom that allowed for the download of games and other media through satellite broadcasts. However, much of the content released on the Satellaview has been lost over time because of how limited and intangible all of it is. There were many popular franchises that were brought into the light of the Satellaview, such as F-Zero, The Legend of Zelda, and even Dr. Mario. Even though Tetris and Dr. Mario released on the Super Famicom in Europe, Japan never got the game due to Bulletproof Software owning the rights to Tetris in Japan. Nintendo finally met its match, so instead, this version of Dr. Mario is broadcasted over the Satellaview, being mostly commonly known as the BS version of Dr. Mario. From March 30th, 1997 through April 2nd, 2000, this version of the game was broadcasted on the Satellaview, and it ended up being the last game broadcasted for the system in general. What is it with Dr. Mario and being late to the party? It's not like he's a real doctor, he's not gonna cure cancer or anything. that dirty rascal. This is just Tetris and Dr. Mario, but with everything about Tetris being wiped from its memory. Apparently, the full game is here though, and there is a way to access it, but if you don't have enough brain cells to figure that one out, you're just gonna have to settle for a downgraded re-release, because that's all this is. It's a neat part of both Nintendo's and the Satellite's history, but I'm glad we were able to move on to bigger and better things. Like Dr. Mario 64. Just because it's better doesn't make it any healthier. This is probably the most in-depth game in the Dr. Mario series, and it might just be the weirdest as well. You're gonna go out and say that when this thing exists? There are several modes in this game, more so than any other Dr. Mario game can claim to have. Going through all of the modes in order, the first is obviously Classic Mode. It's just Dr. Mario, to the shock of the masses. It doesn't change much about the inner workings of Dr. Mario, and it plays similarly to every Dr. Mario game thus far. But the most important addition to this game is probably the Story Mode. I say probably because I'm not sure if anyone else would deem anything in this game to have importance. The story is an overextended chase sequence set on the goal of recovering the stolen Mega Vitamins, which is some sort of super drug from what I can gather. You can either play as Dr. Mario or plain old Wario, with the story going a bit differently depending on what character you play as. But one thing I always found weird was that all of the characters in the story are based off of enemies in Wario Land 3. It was a good game, but to take this much inspiration from that game is an odd decision to put it lightly. But it does give this story a bit more uniqueness than if it were to don the standard Mario attire. It's just several battles with CPUs when it all boils down to it, and it can be beaten in about half an hour. But it might just be the most interesting thing the Dr. Mario series has ever done, aside from the back of the NES box labeling fun as a prescription, which is a great defense for any given situation. But officer, I had to run to the back of that vehicle. My prescription says I'm required to have fun. As for the versus computer mode, I can finally put these things back on. This is nothing new though, as Tetris and Dr. Mario had already made CPU battles a standard. Now the rest of the junk in this game is something that it can claim to be its own. Flash, Marathon, and Score Attack are the new additions that this game has over its predecessors. In Flash, you have to eliminate 3 specific viruses before the other player. Marathon is just an endless game of Dr. Mario where the viruses keep spreading out of the ground akin to an actual disease. And Score Attack has you completing a Dr. Mario puzzle in under 3 minutes to go for a high score. All of these modes are good fun and do a good job in mixing things up. The only thing that I know could probably do a better job is an actual mixer. This game also lets you play as the opponents you faced in the story mode, along with the option to play with different backdrops as well. The multiplayer mode could span up to 4 players in Classic, Flash, and Score Attack, making it the first Dr. Mario to have more than 2-player multiplayer, expanding my options for victims considerably. This might just be the best Dr. Mario game. I've been rather harsh to this game over the past few years, mostly because it was the last notable Nintendo 64 release in North America. You have gotta be kidding me! But after playing it along with the rest of the Dr. Mario series, I can recognize how different this game tries to be. None of the modes are too gimmicky, the story mode gives me something to do with my hands, and the standard Dr. Mario gameplay is still here in all of its glory, with a lot of added elements that make this game's personality unmatched when accounting for the simplicity of the earlier entries and the blandness of later entries. This is the height of the Dr. Mario series. It does what it needs to do to be a well-rounded puzzle game with a decent amount of content, and proves itself to stand the test of time compared to modern releases. Nintendo Puzzle Collection was a compilation of 3 iconic puzzle series on the GameCube that released in 2003, and though we never got it over here in North America, it's easily one of the most recognizable Japan-only titles for the GameCube. Donkey Konga 3 didn't make the cut. The 3 titles on the compilation were Panel de Pon, Yoshi's Cookie, and Dr. Mario. As to briefly mention the former titles, Panel de Pon was built as a sequel to the original game on the Super Famicom, which was re-released internationally as Tetris Attack. A sequel for the game was being developed in Japan, but it was scrapped and internationally released as Pokemon Puzzle League. The game in this compilation is based off of that scrapped sequel. Yoshi's Cookie, however, is simply an enhancement of the 1992 original, and they certainly updated it quite a bit. This is the most interesting game in the package for a few reasons. Reason number 1, it's Yoshi's Cookie. Very few things manage to keep me awake at night. And 2, this is the only game in the package that truly had to be built from the ground up. And it's weird that they would go through all that effort for something like Yoshi's Cookie. But as for the main topic of discussion, this is just a re-release of Dr. Mario 64. All of this is practically identical to Dr. Mario 64, with the only difference being the fact that I can't read it now. But I will forgive it on account of the fact that Dr. Mario 64 never released in Japan. The only changes that this game adds never goes past the title screen, which is a bit strange considering the effort that went into both of the other games in the collection, but again, it's forgivable. It's just that if you play Dr. Mario 64, you've played this version of Dr. Mario. The classic NES series was hell-bent on bringing many of the popular titles on the NES to the side of portability. There was only one problem with that. these are NES games. These are being sold for a crisp $20, and while that doesn't sound too bad to a lunatic like me, that might not be the best value for a game that you most likely get 5 minutes out of, and 5 more if you give it a bath. While Dr. Mario is designed to be an endlessly replayable game, it is understandable as to why it wasn't worthy to the wallets of many. That was a problem people had with this entire product line, and it ended up garnering a wide amount of criticism for a multitude of reasons. So the most I could really call is cute. And it was released as one of the 4 titles in the second wave of the NES Classic titles in North America on October 25th, 2004. So by a technicality, it ended up being the last game released for the series, keeping the tradition alive. But in Japan, the equivalent to the NES Classics was the Famicom mini-series, and these were actually pretty neat. They come in the cutest little recreations of the original boxes, making this a way more pleasurable experience to look at before you even get to the game. Opening these boxes can only be described as a menial chore. These boxes have the one and only goal of satisfying people like me, and while the cartridges aren't the exact color of their Famicom counterparts, the usage of the Famicom color scheme places the non-American inside of me. The whole series is like this, and I've never wanted to live in a different country this badly. On November 28th in 2005, Dr. Mario and Puzzle League signaled the end of an era. This is the last time a version of Dr. Mario will get any sort of physical release, with every game from here on out being downloadable only. All you need to know about the Puzzle League aspect of this game is that it's just paneled upon under a different name. It's quite different from every other game in the series though, not choosing to fall under any set theme, but instead just being a completely standard puzzle game. However, the version of Dr. Mario featured in this game is like a watered down Dr. Mario 64. Many of its elements and modes are exactly the same, with Flash being present as a side mode. Aside from that, it really is just Dr. Mario 64 with a fresh coat of GBA paint. You had the option to play both games vertically by flipping the GBA on its side, but it had to be unlocked, which is something I doubt many had the interest to accomplish. It just isn't that interesting of a release. It's the only game in the series that kinda just happened, and there isn't much interesting lingo around the topic, except for the promotional Flash game that was used to boost sales for this game, going under the name Dr. Mario Vitamin Toss. I mean, it looks harmless enough. It's terrible. This is just a bad online Flash game. One which I probably don't need to describe, as I assume many of you have eyes, and now you probably wish that you didn't. You can still find ways to play it today, but for everyone's sake, please find more productive wastes of time. As for Dr. Mario and Puzzle League, despite it being extremely simple and bringing nothing new to the table, it's still a good time. It's well made and gets a lot of its charm from the cues it takes from Dr. Mario 64, but seeing as it was the last entry in the series that Nintendo deemed good enough for a physical release, I'd say that it was the last time that Dr. Mario felt like a part of the team, because he would really only get worse over time. The WiiWare service was one of the most unique and interesting aspects of the Wii. Alongside the Virtual Console, it made for an incredible online shop that was the first of its kind to innovate as much as it did. Not too long into the service, Dr. Mario Online RX released as a WiiWare exclusive, and it became one of the more recognizable titles on the service. As for the quality of the game, it's okay.
I said the same thing about the sleep I got last night.
I wouldn't call it a bad Dr. Mario game, because everything that makes a good Dr. Mario game is there and at the ready. But there are some smaller things that either make it too gimmicky or too flaccid. The main Dr. Mario mode is here, but it's honestly just as in-depth as the Dr. Mario and Puzzle League version, as it only contains the standard modes along with Flash from Dr. Mario 64, axing 4-player support entirely. But while it tries to make up for that with the addition of the all-new Virus Buster mode, it feels much more suited to a console like the DS, for a reason we'll get to later. Virus Buster has you maneuver several falling pills around a smaller environment with the Wii Remote pointer, and while that feels like something that should be standard for a Wii release of Dr. Mario, it ends up being tiring to point at the screen for such a long game like Dr. Mario. As a result, I end up playing the main mode a lot more often because it requires less effort and is much more addictive. Although, one thing that Virus Buster has over the main mode is 4-player multiplayer, which is still the weirdest decision to me. I honestly feel like they just forgot to add it into the main mode. But the drawing appeal of this game at the time of its release was the online multiplayer, allowing you to play with opponents from around the world. This can't be done today for many reasons, but I can't imagine this causing much of a revolution back when it was released. Okay, this is just outrageous, but even with all of those flaws, it's still Dr. Mario. It's pretty hard to mess up. Even though there isn't much of a reason to play this game today because of its lack of content and defining features that still work, it feels like such a relic of the past, representing what WiiWare wanted to accomplish at the end of the day, providing bite-sized experiences that people could purchase to play every now and then. And considering its low price of $10, it's a painless release that served as another experiment for the Dr. Mario series to go through. Another one of such experiments was Dr. Mario Express for DSiWare. The Express series on DSiWare wasn't very vast, but for the games that it did did include, they were simply die versions of the games that they shared titles with. In this case, Dr. Mario Express is an extremely primitive rendition of Dr. Mario Online RX, only containing the classic Dr. Mario mode. But where I didn't let Online RX get off, Express can be forgiven for being a DSiWare game. These were some of the simplest downloadable titles ever released, and the pick up and play nature of the DS made it so that having a portable Dr. Mario, no matter how simple it would always be good to have on you at all times. That and my birthmark. Despite there not being much to this game, it does satisfy the urge to play Dr. Mario in public, no matter how many people laugh at me. Dr. Luigi is the oddest release in the series. One of the reasons for that is that it's Dr. Luigi. Dr. Luigi was made to celebrate the year Luigi, which I'll still defend as much as I can. Nintendo wasn't doing so hot during this time, with financial struggles appearing left and right, but at the ripe end of 2013, Dr. Luigi was released to the masses, which is when Nintendo regained my faith. This game is very similar to Dr. Mario Online RX, but with two key differences. Number one, Virus Buster is actually fun now. You get to use the stylus on the gamepad to control the capsules, and that makes it so much more quick and precise, which is exactly the facelift that this game needed. But the other difference is the inclusion of Operation L, where all of the pills are L-shaped, and if I'm being honest, I really like this mode. That's right, I'm a sadist. It isn't too different to the point where it becomes difficult or frustrating, and it adds another level of challenge as to how you should move the capsules across the area given a significant decrease in maneuverability. The amount of innovation that this mode shows got me more engrossed in the Dr. Mario formula and how easily everything about it could be changed with just a dash of creativity. And it's funny that all it took was for them to learn to spell. Aside from those modes, Retro Remedy's classic Dr. Mario gameplay and online matches carry over from Online RX. Truthfully, this game isn't anything special, but I'd say that it was the last good Dr. Mario game, because the series was about to hit an extremely new low. It's no secret that Nintendo played it extremely safe throughout the 3DS and Wii U's lives when it came to most of their IPs, which led to one of the blandest eras in Mario's history. Many of the games released during this time were of decent quality, but that was massively overshadowed by their simplicity. Only now can many people recognize those titles for what they were now that we have the games we all wanted out of this era. But that is not the case for Dr. Mario Miracle Cure. This is one of the safest and most forgettable games I have ever played. I honestly think the Game Watch Boy version of Dr. Mario is more interesting simply because there isn't anything out there like it. As for this game, there is no reason on earth that makes owning it justifiable. The only new things that this game adds are optional items that barely have any creativity to them whatsoever, and there's something that I probably find in Candy Crush. Not to mention that it doesn't really fit with the gameplay of Dr. Mario. If the items were wackier and did legitimately interesting things, akin to something like Mario Kart, their inclusion wouldn't be half bad. But to make matters worse, there's only one new mode in this game, and calling it that is more than generous. All it is a compilation of several specifically designed Dr. Mario stages, which isn't even a creative idea. All of the other modes in this game are exactly what you'd expect. Virus Buster is still kicking around, the standard Dr. Mario gameplay is present, and while the presence of Operation L is the one thing that this game did right, there's no reason not to play Dr. Luigi instead. It has much more of a consistent theme, and it's the highest quality looking Dr. Mario game out there on any console. I'd honestly rather play Dr. Mario Express. At least it knew what it was and what it was looking to achieve. Again, neither of these games are all that great, but all this game did was pull a copy and paste job, throw an element into the gameplay that feels tacked on and plain, and went on to become the last Dr. Mario game released on Nintendo consoles as of 2023. This is why I dislike humanity. Dr. Mario World is a game that I don't even have the heart to talk about. I played it when the service was still active, and I realized it was pretty much like every grubby mobile game, practically forcing consumers to pay real-life money for in-game currency. And what I hate is that this is an extremely profitable strategy, but it comes at the cost of dignity. This game is absolutely shameless, and even putting microtransactions off to the side, it's just a bad Dr. Mario game. It really took its Candy Crush influence to heart, and is practically just a clone of it at this point. It's greedy, it's unoriginal, and part of me is glad that it was made unplayable in 2021, but another part of me isn't. This was the last Dr. Mario related product Nintendo ever developed, and the increasing obscurity of the Dr. Mario brand makes its future even more troubling. Unless Nintendo figures out a way to evolve Dr. Mario into being an acceptable modern game, there isn't much hope for the continuance of the franchise. And the thing is, I never really cared about Dr. Mario until I took a look back on its long and complicated history. At its core, it's still the same old puzzle game, but the way Nintendo treated it is nothing short of fascinating, and I can't tell if Nintendo cared about this franchise either, which is understandable given how hard it would be to greatly expand the concepts of an old puzzle game to match up to today's standards. It honestly seems more like a lost cause than anything, but every now and then, Nintendo showed that at least part of them never stopped caring. Dr. Mario was made a playable fighter in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Dr. Wario appeared as a one-off side game in WarioWare Inc. Mega Microgames, and the entire mode of Virus Buster originated as a minigame in Brain Age 2, which was made out of reference to Dr. Mario. All of this showed that Nintendo was willing to throw Dr. Mario fans a bone to keep them and their hopes alive. But the franchise's future looks bleaker than ever, and it's doubtful that we'll ever get another entry given the downward spiral of Dr. Mario World, and the last main entry in the series being released nearly 8 years ago. But you know what? I'll still hold out hope that someday soon, Dr. Mario will finally get the game it deserves. After all it's gone through over the years, getting rid of it is almost out of the question. I never thought I would grow attached to such a niche series, but for all that it's worth, I think that the Dr. Mario series deserves a shot at redemption.
So does his corpse, so I don't think it's getting up anytime soon.